A wealthy heir mocked a black seamstress in her modest shop, dismissing her as a relic of the past. But when his young son fell into complete silence, refusing to speak to anyone, this same woman became his only hope. What she did next with fabric and thread broke down walls that money couldn't touch. A father's pride crumbled, hidden truths surfaced, and both their lives transformed in ways no one could have imagined. A story of redemption, humility, and the healing power of unexpected grace. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart deeply. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and comment below to let us know where you're watching from. On a sweltering summer morning in Millbrook, Connecticut, the scent of burnt thread and fabric softener hung heavy in the air of a modest tailoring shop tucked behind the residential district. Margaret Williams ran her calloused fingertips along the navy lace of an evening gown, making final adjustments for an upcoming charity gala. Her weathered hands moved with the precision that came from 30 years of stitching dreams into reality, each stitch carrying the weight of countless stories she had mended through fabric. Outside, the purr of a luxury sedan broke the morning quiet. The car door slammed with the authority of money, and from it emerged a young man whose very posture screamed entitlement. Alexander Thornfield III stepped onto the cracked pavement with the expression of someone who had accidentally wandered into the wrong postal code. Behind him, his grandmother emerged more gracefully, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the humidity. Eleanor Thornfield had been coming to Margaret's shop for over a decade. While her grandson viewed such places as relics of a bygone era, Eleanor understood something he had yet to learn. Some things couldn't be bought at Bergdorf Goodman or ordered from Milan. Some things required hands that had known struggle, hearts that had weathered storms, and souls that could stitch hope into the most frayed of fabrics. The shop's bell chimed as they entered, and Alexander immediately wrinkled his nose. The space was cramped, filled with mannequins wearing half-finished garments and bolts of fabric stacked to the ceiling. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows, and the linoleum floor had seen better decades. Margaret looked up from her work, acknowledging Eleanor with a warm smile that never quite reached Alexander. Eleanor's eyes lit up as she saw the navy gown. The intricate beadwork caught the light, and the way the fabric draped suggested Margaret had somehow managed to capture moonlight in silk threads. This was why she came here, why she insisted on driving 40 minutes from Greenwich to this little corner of the world that time had overlooked. Alexander, however, saw only what was missing. He saw no marble countertops, no champagne flutes, no assistants rushing to accommodate his every whim. He saw an old black woman in reading glasses, bent over her work in a space that smelled of lavender and hard work. To him, it was almost quaint in its simplicity, almost primitive. He let his gaze wander around the shop, with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. The walls were covered with photographs of Margaret's work, each image telling a story of transformations both literal and metaphorical. Wedding dresses for brides on shoestring budgets, prom gowns for girls whose mothers worked 3 jobs, graduation robes mended just hours before ceremonies. But Alexander saw none of these stories. He saw only a business that had somehow forgotten to evolve. Margaret felt his assessment like a cold draft. She had experienced such looks before, had weathered the subtle and not-so-subtle dismissals that came with being an older black woman in a trade that wealthy people considered quaint when it suited them and irrelevant when it didn't. But something about this young man's particular brand of disdain rankled her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Eleanor moved toward the navy gown with the appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship. She ran her fingers along the beadwork, noting how each sequin had been hand-sewn with a precision that machines couldn't replicate. The way the fabric flowed suggested Margaret had somehow intuited not just Eleanor's measurements, but her very essence as a woman who had carried herself with grace through 8 decades of life. "Margaret, this is extraordinary," Eleanor breathed, her voice carrying genuine awe. "You've outdone yourself." Margaret allowed herself a small smile of pride. She had spent weeks on this piece, staying up long after her shop had closed, working by lamplight to ensure every detail was perfect. The gown wasn't just clothing. It was a celebration of Eleanor's upcoming 80th birthday, a garment worthy of a woman who had raised 3 children, built a foundation for literacy, and somehow maintained her humanity despite being married to one of Connecticut's most ruthless businessmen. Alexander checked his platinum watch with the obvious impatience of someone accustomed to efficient service. He had a golf appointment at the country club, followed by lunch with potential investors, and this detour to what he privately called grandmother's charity case was already running longer than he had allotted. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of Margaret's sewing machine in the corner and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. Eleanor continued examining the gown, pointing out details to Alexander that he acknowledged with non-committal grunts. Margaret returned to her work, but she could feel the young man's restlessness radiating across the small space like heat from a furnace. Finally, Alexander spoke. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never considered that his words might have weight beyond their immediate purpose. "It's amazing these places still exist," he said, loud enough to ensure everyone in the shop could hear. "Like stepping into a museum. Everything here seems so authentic, even the proprietor." The words hit the air like a physical slap. Eleanor's head snapped up, her face flushing with embarrassment and anger. Margaret's hands stilled on her work, her eyes lifting slowly to meet Alexander's gaze. In that moment, the shop fell into a silence so complete that even the street noise seemed to fade away. But Margaret didn't respond. She didn't rise to the bait, didn't defend herself, didn't educate this privileged young man about his manners or his assumptions. Instead, she simply looked at him with eyes that had seen decades of such moments. Eyes that held a depth of experience and wisdom that Alexander couldn't yet fathom. Her gaze was steady, neither challenging nor submissive, but somehow ancient in its patience. Alexander found himself unexpectedly unsettled by her silence. He had expected offense, perhaps even a lecture about respect. Instead, he faced a composure so complete it seemed to expose his own smallness. For a brief moment, he felt like a child who had thrown a tantrum in front of an adult who was too dignified to acknowledge it. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like scissors through silk. "Alexander Thornfield III," she said, using his full name in the tone she had perfected when he was 8 years old and tracking mud through her parlor. "You will apologize immediately." But Margaret shook her head gently. "No need for that, Mrs. Thornfield. Some folks just see the world differently than others. Nothing wrong with that." Her voice carried no anger, no hurt, no defensiveness. Just a simple acknowledgement of difference that somehow made Alexander's words seem both more and less significant than he had intended. Eleanor's face remained flushed with embarrassment, but Margaret had already returned to her work as if the interaction had been as unremarkable as commenting on the weather. Alexander found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his cruelty met with grace. It wasn't what he had expected, and it left him feeling oddly deflated. He had thrown a stone into still water, expecting splash and waves, but the surface had simply absorbed the impact and returned to its natural calm. The remainder of their visit passed in strained politeness. Eleanor completed her transaction with Margaret, while Alexander stood by the window, studying his reflection in the glass and trying to shake the feeling that something had shifted in the shop's atmosphere. When they finally left, he held the door for his grandmother with exaggerated courtesy, as if proper manners could somehow compensate for improper words. Margaret watched their car disappear down the street, then returned to her workbench. She had survived worse than the casual cruelty of entitled young men. Her hands found their rhythm again, stitching together pieces of fabric with the same steady patience she brought to all of life's small repairs. But she couldn't quite shake the image of Alexander's face in that moment after he had spoken. Beneath the arrogance, she had glimpsed something else. A brittleness, perhaps. A carefully constructed facade that suggested he wasn't nearly as comfortable in his own skin as he wanted the world to believe. It was the kind of fragility she had learned to recognize in her decades of working with people's most precious garments. The kind that revealed itself only to those who knew how to look beyond the surface. The days that followed passed normally for Margaret. She completed Eleanor's gown, finished a bridesmaid dress for a young teacher who couldn't afford department store prices, and repaired a favorite jacket for old Mr. Peterson, whose wife had brought it to her before she passed, and who now treated each mending as a sacred ritual. For Alexander, however, the encounter lingered with surprising persistence. He found himself thinking about Margaret's silence at odd moments during board meetings and business dinners, while reviewing quarterly reports and signing acquisition papers. The memory surfaced uninvited, like a pebble in his shoe that he couldn't quite dislodge. It wasn't guilt, exactly. Alexander had built his identity around being above such pedestrian emotions. He was a Thornfield, heir to a textile empire that had dressed America's elite for 4 generations. He moved in circles where feelings were inconveniences and apologies were admissions of weakness. But something about Margaret's response had bypassed his usual defenses, creating a discomfort he couldn't quite categorize or dismiss. He told himself it was the contrast between her dignity and his grandmother's obvious mortification. Eleanor had barely spoken to him during their drive home, her disapproval radiating from the passenger seat like cold fog. At dinner that evening, she had delivered a lecture about respect and humility that would have been more appropriate for a teenager than a 28-year-old CEO. The entire incident had been blown out of proportion, he decided. A momentary lapse in social grace magnified by his grandmother's tendency toward melodrama. But the rationalization didn't quite stick. Late at night, when the business of being a Thornfield quieted down and he was left alone with his thoughts, Alexander found himself remembering the way Margaret had looked at him, not with anger or hurt, but with something that felt almost like compassion, as if she had seen through his words to something he didn't even know he was revealing. The call came on a Thursday evening, just as Alexander was reviewing contracts for a potential acquisition in North Carolina. His housekeeper, Mrs. Hendricks, sounded unusually flustered when she asked if she could speak with him privately. She had been with the family for 15 years, managing his household with the efficiency of a Swiss timepiece, and Alexander couldn't remember ever hearing uncertainty in her voice. Mrs. Hendricks explained that she had a request that was somewhat unusual. It concerned Alexander's son, 8-year-old William, who had been struggling since starting at his new private school 3 weeks earlier. The boy had stopped speaking almost entirely, spent most of his time alone in his room, and seemed to respond only to textures and manual activities. The school counselor had recommended therapy, but William refused to engage with any of the specialists they had consulted. Alexander felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever his son's difficulties were mentioned. William had always been different, sensitive in ways that reminded Alexander uncomfortably of his ex-wife, Sarah. After their divorce 2 years earlier, the boy had struggled with the transition between households, but his recent withdrawal was more complete than anything they had seen before. Mrs. Hendricks continued, her voice growing softer. She had heard from Eleanor about a seamstress who had worked with children before, someone who understood how to communicate without words. It was unconventional, certainly, but conventional approaches weren't helping William. Would Alexander consider allowing this woman to visit, just to see if she could reach the boy where others had failed? Alexander's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of bringing a stranger into his home to work with his son struck him as both desperate and potentially harmful. William needed professional help, not folk remedies from someone whose qualifications consisted of knowing how to hem pants. But Mrs. Hendricks' voice carried a note of genuine concern that gave him pause. The truth was that Alexander felt increasingly helpless when it came to his son. The divorce had been messy and public, covered extensively in the society pages and business journals. Sarah had accused him of being emotionally unavailable, of treating their marriage like another acquisition to be managed rather than a relationship to be nurtured. The allegations had stung because they weren't entirely false. Since gaining primary custody, Alexander had thrown money at William's problems with the same efficiency he brought to solving business challenges. Private schools, tutors, therapists, specialists, all the resources that money could buy. But the boy continued to retreat further into himself, and Alexander found himself increasingly frustrated by his inability to simply fix what was broken. Mrs. Hendricks was still waiting for his response. Alexander looked out his office window at the manicured grounds of his Greenwich estate, considering options he had never imagined needing. The irony wasn't lost on him that the solution being proposed involved the very woman he had insulted just weeks earlier. "This seamstress," he said finally. "Where exactly did grandmother find her?" Mrs. Hendricks explained about Margaret's shop, about Eleanor's long-standing relationship with the woman, about the unusual requests that had come through grandmother's connections, rather than through official channels. Alexander felt his stomach tighten as he realized they were talking about the woman from the fabric shop, the one whose dignity he had tried and failed to disturb. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Mrs. Hendricks carefully outlining what she knew about Margaret's background and approach. Apparently, the woman had worked with several children over the years, always quietly, always without formal recognition or payment. She used textiles and manual work to help children who struggled with traditional forms of communication. It wasn't therapy in any recognized sense, but it had proven effective in cases where conventional methods had failed. Alexander found himself agreeing to the meeting before he had fully processed the decision. Something about Mrs. Hendricks' carefully measured words, combined with his own growing desperation regarding William's condition, made the unconventional approach seem less risky than continued failure with traditional methods. The appointment was set for the following Saturday morning. Margaret would come to the house, meet with William, and provide her assessment of whether she might be able to help. No commitments beyond that initial meeting, no long-term obligations, just a conversation between a woman who understood silence and a boy who had chosen it as his primary form of communication. As Alexander ended the call, he realized he was nervous in a way he hadn't experienced since his first board presentation. The prospect of facing Margaret again, of acknowledging even implicitly that he needed help from someone he had dismissed so casually, created a discomfort that had nothing to do with business strategy or financial risk. He spent the next 2 days trying to prepare for the meeting, researching unconventional therapeutic approaches and reading about children who struggled with traditional forms of communication. But nothing he found quite explained why Mrs. Hendricks and his grandmother believed a seamstress might succeed where trained professionals had failed. Friday evening, Alexander found himself standing in William's doorway, watching his son arrange colored pencils in precise geometric patterns. The boy's concentration was absolute, his small hands moving with surprising coordination as he created designs that suggested both mathematical precision and artistic sensibility. For a moment, Alexander felt a surge of recognition. He had done similar things as a child, finding comfort in order and pattern when the emotional world felt too chaotic to navigate. William looked up, acknowledging his father's presence with a brief nod before returning to his careful arrangements. The boy had his mother's dark eyes and delicate features, but something in his expression reminded Alexander of looking in the mirror. They were both more comfortable with things they could control, both more at ease with systems than with people. "Someone's coming to see you tomorrow," Alexander said gently. "A lady who makes clothes. She's going to bring some materials for you to look at." William's hands stilled on his pencils, but he didn't look up. Alexander waited, hoping for some sign of interest or concern, but the boy's face remained carefully neutral. It was an expression Alexander recognized from his own childhood, the mask of polite disengagement that children learn when they can't afford to reveal their real feelings. "You don't have to talk to her if you don't want to," Alexander continued. "Just see what she brings. Mrs. Hendricks thinks you might like it." This time, William did look up, his dark eyes searching his father's face for information that wasn't being spoken. Alexander felt the familiar inadequacy that came whenever he tried to connect with his son, the sense that they were speaking different languages despite using the same words. "Is she nice?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught Alexander off guard. It was the first time William had spoken voluntarily in over a week, and the simple inquiry carried more weight than it should have. Alexander found himself thinking about Margaret's response to his rudeness, about the grace she had shown in the face of casual cruelty. "I think so," he said honestly. "I think she's very nice." William nodded once and returned to his pencils. The conversation was over, but something had shifted between them. For the first time in weeks, Alexander felt as though his son had actually heard him. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid, with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. Alexander found himself checking his watch repeatedly, wondering if Margaret would arrive on time, if she would come at all. The part of him that understood business relationships couldn't quite comprehend why someone would agree to help the child of a man who had insulted her, especially without payment or recognition. At exactly 10 o'clock, a modest Honda Civic pulled into the circular driveway. Margaret emerged wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a large fabric bag that looked as though it had traveled many miles and seen many uses. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had learned to be comfortable in places where she wasn't initially welcome. Alexander met her at the front door, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. The grand entrance hall of the Thornfield estate stretched behind him, all marble floors and oil paintings, while she stood on the threshold with her practical bag and patient expression. The contrast between their worlds had never been more apparent. "Mrs. Williams," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Margaret's handshake was firm and brief. "Mr. Thornfield, I understand your boy is having a difficult time." Her directness bypassed the usual social preliminaries that Alexander was accustomed to navigating. There was no mention of their previous encounter, no acknowledgement of the awkwardness that hung between them. Just a simple statement of purpose that reminded him why she was there. Mrs. Hendricks appeared to guide Margaret through the house, and Alexander followed at a distance, noting how she took in her surroundings without obvious judgment or awe. The opulent furnishings and expensive artwork that usually intimidated first-time visitors seemed to register only as background information, no more significant than the weather outside. William's room was on the second floor, overlooking the gardens that Sarah had designed during their marriage. The space was large enough to serve as a small apartment, filled with educational toys and expensive furniture that somehow managed to feel both luxurious and sterile. William sat at his desk, arranging the same colored pencils in the same precise patterns. Wearing pajamas despite the late morning hour, Margaret entered quietly, settling her bag on the floor near the window where natural light fell across the hardwood. She didn't approach William directly or attempt to engage him in conversation. Instead, she began removing items from her bag with the same careful attention she brought to her needlework. Fabric swatches in various textures and colors, spools of thread that caught the light, a small pair of scissors that looked as though they had been worn smooth by years of use. Alexander watched from the doorway as Margaret arranged her materials on the floor, creating what looked like a textile garden in miniature. She worked without speaking, her movements deliberate and soothing. Gradually, William's attention shifted from his pencils to the growing display of colors and textures. The boy slipped from his chair and approached slowly, drawn by curiosity stronger than his usual caution. Margaret continued her work, acknowledging his presence with a slight smile, but making no demands on his attention. When William reached for a piece of soft velvet, she simply nodded as if his choice was both expected and wise. For the next hour, Alexander watched an interaction unlike any he had witnessed between his son and an adult. Margaret seemed to understand instinctively that William communicated through touch and arrangement rather than words. She showed him how different fabrics felt, how they caught light differently, how they could be folded and shaped into new forms. William began to relax in ways Alexander hadn't seen since before the divorce. The boy's shoulders dropped, his movements became less careful, and eventually he began making small sounds of pleasure when he discovered textures that particularly appealed to him. Margaret responded to each sound as if it carried the weight of conversation, nodding and murmuring encouragement that seemed to reach William in places that words couldn't access. When she finally packed her materials away, William helped her, carefully placing each item back in the bag as if he understood their value. As she prepared to leave, he looked up at her with an expression of hope that Alexander recognized but hadn't seen in months. "Will you come back?" William asked, his voice clear and certain. Margaret smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Alexander had seen her offer since their initial meeting. "If your father says it's all right, I'd like that very much." Both of them looked at Alexander, waiting for his response. In that moment, he realized that his answer would determine more than just whether Margaret returned to work with William. It would establish whether he was capable of setting aside his pride long enough to accept help from someone he had wronged, whether he could acknowledge that his son's needs mattered more than his own comfort. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Please, come back." As Margaret left that morning, Alexander found himself standing in William's room, looking at the space where she had worked her quiet magic. The boy had returned to his desk but seemed more animated than he had in weeks, humming softly as he arranged his pencils in new patterns, inspired by the fabric arrangements he had seen. For the first time since the divorce, Alexander felt something that might have been hope. Not the desperate kind that came from trying the latest specialist or therapy, but something quieter and more sustainable. The hope that came from witnessing genuine connection, from seeing his son respond to an approach that honored rather than tried to fix his particular way of being in the world. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to streak the windows. But inside William's room, something had shifted. The careful arrangements of colored pencils now included spaces for textures and fabrics, and the boy who had barely spoken in weeks was humming as he worked. Alexander realized that Margaret's first visit had already accomplished something that months of traditional therapy had not. She had reminded William that the world contained beauty and wonder, that his particular gifts for pattern and texture were valuable rather than problematic. More importantly, she had shown both father and son that healing sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. As he watched his son work, Alexander found himself thinking about apologies he hadn't yet offered and assumptions he hadn't yet examined. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, he felt as though they might be moving in the right direction. Margaret's second visit came the following Tuesday, and this time William was waiting by the window when her car pulled into the driveway. Alexander watched from his home office as his son pressed his face against the glass, his small hands leaving foggy prints that he traced with obvious excitement. It was the most animated he had seen the boy since before the school troubles began. The transformation in William during that second session was even more remarkable than the first. Margaret had brought different materials this time: silk ribbons that fluttered like butterflies, rough burlap that scratched interestingly against small fingers, and cotton so soft it seemed to absorb worry. She spread them across William's bedroom floor like a textile rainbow, and the boy immediately gravitated toward a piece of deep purple satin that seemed to hold secrets in its folds. What struck Alexander most was not just William's engagement with the materials, but the way Margaret seemed to understand his son's particular language. When William arranged fabrics in careful geometric patterns, she didn't try to redirect him toward more traditional play. Instead, she followed his lead, adding complementary pieces that enhanced rather than disrupted his designs. When he made small humming sounds while working, she hummed along in harmony, creating a wordless conversation that seemed to reach places inside the boy that speech couldn't access. By the end of that second visit, William had created his first textile story. Using Margaret's guidance, he had arranged different fabrics to represent a garden where every flower was a different texture. The story had no words, but it conveyed a sense of peace and safety that Alexander hadn't seen in his son's work before. When Margaret asked if he wanted to tell her about his garden, William didn't speak, but he carefully touched each fabric piece and made soft sounds that seemed to carry meaning between them. As Margaret prepared to leave, William surprised everyone by asking if he could show his textile garden to his father. Alexander entered the room with the careful reverence of someone approaching something sacred, and William guided him through the fabric landscape with more words than he had spoken in weeks. The boy explained how the velvet represented soil that was comfortable to sleep in, how the silk ribbons were streams that carried away sad feelings, and how the purple satin was a special tree where worries could be hung like ornaments and forgotten. For Alexander, hearing his son speak with such clarity and imagination was like watching a flower bloom in fast motion. The child who had been retreating into silence for months was suddenly articulate about his inner world, using fabric as a bridge between his private thoughts and shared communication. That evening, for the first time since the divorce, William asked his father to read him a bedtime story. But transformation, Alexander was learning, rarely happened in isolation. William's progress at home began to create ripples that extended into other areas of his life, and not all of those ripples were welcome. At Millbrook Academy, William's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed that the boy was bringing small pieces of fabric to school, keeping them in his pocket and touching them during difficult moments. While she was pleased to see him more engaged and communicative, the fabric pieces were becoming a distraction to other students and a source of curiosity that Mrs. Patterson wasn't sure how to manage. The school's approach to unusual behavior was firmly rooted in conventional educational theory. Children who struggled with traditional classroom environments were redirected through established therapeutic channels, not through folk remedies involving textiles. When Mrs. Patterson mentioned William's fabric pieces during a parent-teacher conference, she suggested that perhaps the boy was becoming too dependent on these comfort objects and might benefit from learning to cope without them. Alexander found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending an approach he still didn't fully understand. He explained about Margaret's work with William, about the remarkable progress the boy had made, about the way fabric seemed to help his son process emotions and communicate more effectively. But Mrs. Patterson's expression grew increasingly concerned as he spoke. From her perspective, allowing a child to depend on external objects for emotional regulation was enabling rather than therapeutic. The conversation revealed a fundamental divide between two different philosophies of healing. Mrs. Patterson believed in helping children adapt to the world as it existed, developing coping mechanisms that would serve them in traditional academic and social environments. Margaret's approach seemed to honor William's natural inclinations rather than redirecting them, creating space for his particular way of processing the world rather than teaching him to mask or overcome his differences. That evening, Alexander found himself facing a dilemma he hadn't anticipated. William was thriving at home, but his progress was creating new challenges at school. The boy's teachers wanted him to conform to conventional expectations, while Margaret's methods seemed to be moving him in the opposite direction, toward greater authenticity and self-expression. The tension came to a head during William's third week of working with Margaret. The boy had become confident enough to share one of his textile stories during show and tell, carefully arranging fabric pieces while explaining how different textures represented different feelings. His classmates were fascinated, but several parents who volunteered in the classroom that day were less enthusiastic. Jennifer Morrison, whose daughter Chloe was in William's class, called Alexander that evening, with what she described as concerns about classroom disruption. She explained that William's fabric presentations were confusing the other children, making them question why they couldn't bring their own comfort objects to school. More troubling, from Jennifer's perspective, was the fact that William was crediting his improvements to someone who wasn't a licensed therapist. The conversation that followed was polite but pointed. Jennifer suggested that while Alexander's intentions were clearly good, allowing an unlicensed person to work with a troubled child might not be in William's best interests. She mentioned that several other parents shared her concerns and wondered if it might be wise to consult with actual child development specialists before continuing with such an unconventional approach. Alexander found himself defending Margaret with a passion that surprised him. He explained about William's progress, about the way the boy had begun communicating again, about the return of light to his son's eyes. But Jennifer's concerns weren't entirely without merit. Margaret wasn't licensed, wasn't trained in child psychology, wasn't operating within any recognized therapeutic framework. What if her methods were creating dependencies that would ultimately harm William's development? That night, Alexander lay awake questioning decisions he had begun to feel confident about. The rational part of his mind recognized the validity of the concerns being raised. He had built his business success on careful analysis of risk and benefit, on making decisions based on measurable outcomes and proven methodologies. Margaret's work with William existed outside those frameworks, in a space where success was measured in smiles and spontaneous conversations rather than standardized assessments. But the father in him couldn't ignore what he had witnessed. William was happier, more communicative, more engaged with the world around him. The boy who had been disappearing into silence was emerging with stories to tell and enthusiasm for sharing them. How could something that was clearly helping his son be wrong? The crisis deepened the following week when Margaret arrived for her regular session to find Mrs. Hendricks waiting with uncomfortable news. Millbrook Academy's principal had called, requesting a meeting with Alexander to discuss William's educational needs. Specifically, they wanted to review the unconventional therapeutic approach he was receiving and determine whether it was compatible with the school's academic goals. Margaret listened to this information with the same calm demeanor she brought to everything else, but Alexander could see something flicker across her expression. Not fear, exactly, but a familiar weariness that suggested she had encountered such institutional resistance before. When Mrs. Hendricks finished explaining the situation, Margaret simply nodded and asked if William was ready for his session. But Alexander couldn't let it go so easily. He found himself following Margaret upstairs, needing to understand how she viewed the growing opposition to her work. As they reached William's room, he touched her arm gently, asking if they could speak privately before she began working with his son. In the hallway outside William's door, Margaret finally addressed the elephant that had been growing larger each week. She explained that she had worked with children before, always quietly, always without formal recognition. Sometimes the children improved, sometimes they didn't, but she had learned that institutional approval was rarely part of the equation. Schools, hospitals, and therapy centers operated within established systems that didn't leave room for approaches like hers. She told Alexander about Marcus, a 10-year-old boy who had stopped eating after his father's deployment overseas. Traditional therapy had failed to reach him, but he had responded to Margaret's idea of sewing small comfort objects that could accompany him to the cafeteria. The boy had eventually begun eating again, but when his mother tried to share their success with the school counselor, the response had been skepticism and concern about enabling unhealthy coping mechanisms. There was also Elena, a teenage girl struggling with anxiety who had found peace in embroidery projects that helped her process difficult emotions. Elena's psychiatrist had initially been dismissive of the textile work, insisting that real healing required pharmaceutical intervention and cognitive behavioral therapy. It wasn't until the girl's anxiety decreased significantly that the doctor reluctantly acknowledged the embroidery might be playing a helpful role. Margaret's voice remained steady as she shared these stories, but Alexander could hear the accumulated weight of having her work questioned and dismissed by professionals who operated within different frameworks. She wasn't bitter, exactly, but there was a resignation in her tone that suggested she had learned to expect resistance rather than recognition. What moved Alexander most was Margaret's explanation of why she continued this work despite the challenges. She spoke about seeing children trapped in silence or fear, about recognizing in them something she had known in herself decades earlier. The ability to reach these children, to offer them a bridge back to communication and connection, felt like a calling rather than a choice. The opposition from institutions was painful, but it wasn't enough to make her stop trying to help. As Margaret spoke, Alexander found himself thinking about his own relationship with institutional approval. His entire life had been shaped by systems that rewarded conformity and measured success in conventional terms: business school, corporate hierarchies, social expectations. He had navigated these frameworks successfully by understanding their rules and playing by them effectively. But watching William's transformation had shown him something that didn't fit within those established systems. His son was healing through methods that couldn't be quantified or standardized, through a relationship with someone who operated outside professional credentials and institutional authority. The progress was real, measurable in ways that mattered more than any assessment tool. But it existed in a space that formal systems struggled to acknowledge or accommodate. When Margaret finished speaking, Alexander realized he was facing a choice that would define not just William's immediate future, but his own understanding of what it meant to be a father. He could capitulate to institutional pressure, discontinue Margaret's sessions, and return William to conventional therapeutic approaches that had already proven ineffective. Or he could trust what he had witnessed with his own eyes, defend an approach that was clearly helping his son, and accept the social and professional complications that might result. The meeting with Millbrook Academy's administration took place on a gray Thursday morning in Principal Harrison's office. Alexander arrived wearing his most authoritative business suit, prepared for a conversation that would require all his negotiating skills. Across from him sat Principal Harrison, Mrs. Patterson, and the school's consulting psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, all arranged with the formal gravity of an intervention. Dr. Chen opened the discussion by acknowledging William's recent improvements in classroom participation and social interaction. The boy was clearly making progress, she said, but the school had concerns about the methods being used to achieve that progress. Specifically, they were troubled by William's reliance on textile objects for emotional regulation, and his attribution of his improvements to someone without formal training in child development. Principal Harrison explained that Millbrook Academy maintained high standards for therapeutic interventions, working only with licensed professionals who operated within established frameworks. While they appreciated Alexander's creativity in seeking help for his son, they were concerned that the current approach might create dependencies that would ultimately interfere with William's academic and social development. Mrs. Patterson added that William's fabric presentations, while charming, were beginning to disrupt classroom routines and confuse other children about appropriate school behavior. Several parents had expressed concern that their own children were requesting permission to bring comfort objects to school, creating a situation that could quickly become unmanageable. As Alexander listened to these carefully worded concerns, he felt the familiar pressure of institutional authority. These were educated professionals speaking from years of experience, armed with research and best practices that supported their position. The rational response would be to acknowledge their expertise and adjust William's treatment accordingly. But then he thought about the light in his son's eyes when Margaret arrived each week, about the stories William now told with enthusiasm and creativity, about the way the boy had begun reaching out to connect rather than retreating into isolation. The progress might not fit within conventional frameworks, but it was undeniably real and profoundly meaningful. Alexander found himself making a choice that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He thanked the administrators for their concerns, acknowledged the validity of their institutional perspective, but firmly stated that he would continue Margaret's work with William. If the school couldn't accommodate his son's particular needs and learning style, perhaps it was time to consider educational alternatives that would be more supportive of William's growth. The room fell silent after his declaration. Principal Harrison's expression shifted from professional concern to something approaching alarm. Millbrook Academy prided itself on retaining families from Connecticut's most influential circles, and losing a Thornfield would create repercussions that extended far beyond educational considerations. Dr. Chen attempted to find middle ground, suggesting that perhaps Margaret's work could continue alongside conventional therapy, with regular assessments to ensure that William's development remained on track. But Alexander had moved beyond compromise. He had seen what happened when his son was allowed to flourish according to his own nature, rather than being forced into predetermined molds, and he wasn't willing to risk that progress for the comfort of institutional approval. The meeting ended with an uncomfortable detente. The school would allow William to continue his current approach while monitoring his progress carefully. Any signs that his development was being compromised would trigger a mandatory review of his therapeutic interventions. Alexander agreed to these terms, but privately he was already researching alternative educational options that might be more compatible with his son's emerging strengths. That evening, Alexander called his ex-wife Sarah to update her on the situation. Their conversations had become businesslike since the divorce, focused on logistics and scheduling rather than the emotional complexities of co-parenting. But something about the day's events made him want to share William's progress with the person who had known him longest and loved him most completely. Sarah listened with growing amazement as Alexander described William's transformation. She had noticed improvements during her weekend visits with their son, but she hadn't realized the extent of his progress or the unconventional methods that were fostering it. Her initial response was skepticism, similar to what Alexander had encountered at the school, but as he described specific examples of William's growth, her tone shifted to something approaching wonder. The conversation that followed was the longest and most honest they had shared since their separation. Sarah admitted that she had been worried about William's withdrawal, concerned that the divorce had damaged him in ways that might prove permanent. Hearing about his renewed engagement with the world, his growing confidence and communication skills, filled her with relief that went beyond words. But Sarah also understood the social and professional risks Alexander was taking by defending such an unconventional approach. As a pediatric nurse, she worked within medical systems that prioritized evidence-based practices and professional credentials. Margaret's methods, however effective they might be proving for William, existed outside the frameworks that Sarah had been trained to trust and respect. Their conversation ended with an agreement to meet with Margaret together, allowing Sarah to observe the work firsthand before offering her perspective as both William's mother and a healthcare professional. It was the first time since their divorce that they had approached a parenting decision as true partners rather than adversaries negotiating custody arrangements. Margaret's reaction to meeting Sarah was characteristically gracious and unassuming. She welcomed the opportunity to explain her approach to someone with medical training, acknowledging Sarah's concerns, while gently demonstrating the methods that had proven effective with William. The session that followed was unlike any Alexander had previously witnessed. With both parents present, William seemed to understand that something significant was happening. He approached Margaret's materials with more deliberate intention than usual, carefully selecting fabrics that would tell a story his mother hadn't heard before. Using textures and arrangements that had become his artistic vocabulary, he created a narrative about a family that had been torn apart, but was learning to be whole in new ways. The story was sophisticated in its emotional complexity, using rough burlap to represent sadness and conflict, soft cotton for comfort and understanding, and silk ribbons to show connections that remained strong even when they changed form. As William explained his textile narrative, both Alexander and Sarah found themselves moved to tears by their son's wisdom and resilience. For Sarah, watching William communicate with such clarity and depth was nothing short of miraculous. The child who had been retreating into silence was not only speaking, but expressing complex emotional insights that suggested healing rather than mere coping. Margaret's methods might not fit within conventional therapeutic frameworks, but their effectiveness was undeniable. After William finished his presentation, Sarah asked Margaret to explain her approach more thoroughly. The conversation that followed revealed depths to Margaret's work that Alexander was only beginning to understand. She spoke about texture as a form of language, about the way different materials could represent and process emotions that children couldn't yet express in words. Her methods weren't random or intuitive, but based on decades of careful observation about how children naturally gravitated toward sensory experiences when verbal communication felt inadequate or unsafe. Margaret also shared more of her own story, explaining how her understanding of silence and healing had been shaped by personal experiences with loss and recovery. She had learned to sew as a child, finding in needlework a form of meditation and expression that helped her process difficulties too complex for words. When she began working with children decades later, she discovered that many of them responded to similar approaches, using texture and creation as bridges back to communication and connection. By the end of that meeting, Sarah was not only supportive of Margaret's continued work with William, but eager to learn more about incorporating textile activities into their son's time at her apartment. For the first time since their divorce, Alexander and Sarah found themselves united in their approach to William's care, both committed to supporting methods that honored their son's particular gifts, rather than trying to standardize them. The following weeks brought changes that extended far beyond William's therapeutic progress. Word of his transformation had begun to spread through Greenwich's interconnected social networks, creating curiosity and conversation about the unconventional methods that were producing such remarkable results. Some families expressed interest in learning more about Margaret's approach, while others remained skeptical about techniques that operated outside established professional frameworks. Jennifer Morrison, whose initial concerns had sparked the school meeting, found herself reconsidering her position after witnessing William's growth firsthand. Her own daughter Chloe had struggled with anxiety around test-taking, and traditional counseling approaches had provided limited relief. When Chloe expressed interest in learning about William's textile stories, Jennifer began to wonder if there might be value in methods she had initially dismissed. The shift in community perception created new opportunities but also new challenges. Margaret found herself receiving requests from other families seeking help for children with various difficulties. Some wanted quick fixes for behavioral problems, Others hoped for alternatives to medication or conventional therapy. Margaret approached each inquiry with the same careful consideration she brought to all her work, accepting only cases where she felt her particular methods might genuinely help. But the growing attention also attracted criticism from some quarters of Greenwich society. Dr. Amanda Foster, whose private practice specialized in child psychology, expressed concern about unlicensed individuals providing therapeutic services to vulnerable children. She worried that Margaret's apparent success with William might encourage other families to abandon evidence-based treatments in favor of folk remedies that could ultimately prove harmful. The controversy came to a head during a PTA meeting at Millbrook Academy, where parents gathered to discuss various school policies and programs. What began as a routine discussion about after-school activities evolved into a heated debate about appropriate therapeutic interventions for children struggling with emotional or behavioral challenges. Jennifer Morrison, who had initially opposed Margaret's methods, found herself defending them against parents who questioned the wisdom of allowing unlicensed practitioners to work with troubled children. She described the remarkable changes she had witnessed in William, the way textile work had helped her own daughter process anxiety, and the gentle wisdom Margaret brought to her interactions with children who struggled with traditional approaches. But Dr. Foster countered with concerns about accountability and professional standards. She argued that allowing unlicensed individuals to provide therapeutic services, however well-intentioned, could set dangerous precedents that might ultimately harm children who needed proper professional care. The debate grew increasingly passionate, revealing fundamental disagreements about healing, authority, and the proper relationship between institutional knowledge and individual experience. Alexander, who had been prepared to defend Margaret's work if necessary, found himself surprised by the level of support she received from unexpected quarters. Parents who had initially seemed skeptical shared stories of their own children's struggles with conventional therapeutic approaches, their frustration with systems that seemed more focused on diagnosis than healing, their gratitude for anyone who could reach their children where they had been unreachable before. The meeting ended without resolution, but the debate had accomplished something neither side had anticipated. It had forced the community to examine their assumptions about healing and expertise, about the relationship between professional credentials and effective care, about the proper balance between institutional authority and individual choice in matters of children's well-being. For Margaret, the controversy was both familiar and exhausting. She had encountered similar resistance throughout her decades of working with children, had learned to expect institutional suspicion rather than support. But something about this particular debate felt different. For the first time, she found herself with articulate defenders who spoke from direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The evening after the PTA meeting, Margaret received a phone call that would change everything about her quiet work with individual families. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, director of the Children's Creative Therapy Center in nearby Stamford, had heard about the debate surrounding Margaret's methods and wanted to meet with her to discuss possible collaboration. Dr. Rodriguez explained that her center specialized in innovative approaches to child therapy, incorporating art, music, movement, and other creative modalities into treatment programs for children who struggled with traditional talk therapy. She had been following research about sensory processing and textile work, and she was intrigued by the reports of Margaret's success with William and other children. The conversation that followed was unlike any Margaret had experienced in her years of informal therapeutic work. Dr. Rodriguez spoke about the limitations of conventional approaches for many children, about the growing recognition that healing could take many forms, about the need for therapeutic methods that honored rather than pathologized children's natural ways of processing the world. What Dr. Rodriguez proposed was revolutionary in its implications. She wanted to invite Margaret to work within the center's framework, providing textile therapy under professional supervision, while contributing to research about sensory-based therapeutic approaches. Margaret would maintain her methods while gaining institutional support, professional backing, and the opportunity to help more children while contributing to broader understanding of alternative healing modalities. For Margaret, the proposal represented validation she had never expected and opportunities she had never imagined. But it also required her to step out of the shadows where she had always worked, to submit her intuitive methods to academic scrutiny, to collaborate with professionals whose training and perspectives might differ significantly from her own experience-based knowledge. The decision she faced would affect not only her own future, but the lives of children like William who might benefit from approaches that bridge the gap between conventional therapy and traditional wisdom. As Margaret considered Dr. Rodriguez's offer, she found herself thinking about all the children she had worked with over the years. all the ones she might be able to help if her methods gained institutional acceptance and support. But she also thought about the quiet intimacy of her current work, the way she could focus entirely on each child's individual needs, without the pressures and complications that came with institutional oversight. The choice before her represented a fundamental shift from individual healing to systemic change, from private service to public advocacy. As Margaret pondered this unexpected opportunity, William was experiencing his own moment of decision. His confidence had grown sufficiently that he wanted to share his textile stories with his classmates in a more formal way, to demonstrate how fabrics could tell stories and express feelings that words sometimes couldn't capture. With Margaret's guidance, he had been preparing a presentation for his class, creating textile landscapes that illustrated different emotions and experiences. But sharing his work more publicly would require William to step beyond the safety of individual sessions and family support. It would mean exposing his particular gifts to peer evaluation, risking the kind of judgment and misunderstanding that sensitive children often face when they reveal their authentic selves to the world. The convergence of these two decisions, Margaret's choice about institutional collaboration and William's desire to share his textile stories more broadly, created a moment of possibility that neither had anticipated. Their individual journeys toward healing and self-expression were becoming part of a larger story about the relationship between conventional wisdom and innovative approaches, between institutional authority and individual experience. As the first major phase of their relationship drew to a close, both Margaret and William stood at thresholds that would determine not only their own futures, but the lives of other children who might benefit from therapeutic approaches that honored rather than redirected their natural ways of processing the world. The quiet work that had begun in a small bedroom was evolving into something with the potential to influence how society understood and supported children whose gifts existed outside conventional frameworks. The transformation that had begun with one boy's silence and one woman's patient wisdom was about to become something larger and more complex than either had imagined. But whether that expansion would preserve the intimate healing that had made their work effective remained to be seen. Change, even positive change, always carried the risk of losing the very qualities that made the original experience valuable. As Margaret prepared for her next session with William, she carried both the weight of Dr. Rodriguez's offer and the lightness of watching a child rediscover his voice through texture and story. The future remained unwritten, full of possibilities that could lead toward greater healing for more children, or toward the kind of institutional complications that had historically made her work more difficult rather than more effective. William, meanwhile, practiced arranging his textile story with the careful attention of someone preparing to share something precious and fragile with the world. His presentation would be his first public declaration that healing could come through unconventional pathways, that children's natural wisdom sometimes surpassed adult expertise, that silence could be a doorway to communication rather than evidence of withdrawal. Neither Margaret nor William yet understood how profoundly their individual choices would affect each other and the broader community watching their unusual partnership with mixtures of hope, skepticism, curiosity, and concern. But both sensed that they stood at the edge of changes that would test everything they had learned about trust, courage, and the delicate relationship between healing and being healed. William's presentation was scheduled for Friday morning, during the weekly show-and-tell period that had become his favorite part of the school week. He had spent days preparing his textile story with Margaret's guidance, creating a landscape of fabrics that would demonstrate how different textures could represent complex emotions and experiences. The night before his presentation, he carefully packed his materials in the same bag Margaret used, treating each piece of fabric with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects. But Friday morning brought news that would shatter the careful progress of the previous months. Margaret's phone call came at 6:30. Her voice strained with an exhaustion that Alexander had never heard before. Her mother, who lived alone in a senior community in Hartford, had suffered a severe stroke during the night. The doctors weren't sure if she would survive, and Margaret needed to leave immediately to be with her. The timing couldn't have been worse. William had been counting on Margaret's presence for his presentation, had practiced his textile story with her guidance, had found confidence in knowing she would be there to support him if he became overwhelmed. Without her steady presence, the idea of sharing his work with classmates who might not understand felt suddenly impossible. Alexander found himself facing a parenting moment that required skills he hadn't developed. William sat at his breakfast table, tears streaming down his face as he processed the news that Margaret wouldn't be there for his presentation. The boy's careful emotional regulation, built through weeks of textile work and patient encouragement, crumbled in the face of this unexpected abandonment. For the first time since Margaret had begun working with William, Alexander saw his son retreat into the silence that had characterized his worst days. The boy pushed away his breakfast, gathered his textile materials, and disappeared into his room without speaking. When Alexander tried to follow, he found the door locked, and no response to his gentle knocking. Mrs. Hendricks suggested postponing the presentation until Margaret could return, but Alexander knew that might be weeks or longer depending on her mother's condition. William had been building toward this moment of sharing his work publicly, and delaying might destroy the confidence he had spent months developing. But proceeding without Margaret felt equally risky, potentially exposing the boy to judgment and misunderstanding without the support system that had made his growth possible. The crisis deepened when Sarah arrived that evening for her scheduled weekend with William. She found their son still locked in his room, unresponsive to either parents' attempts at comfort or communication. The textile materials that had become his primary means of expression lay abandoned on his desk, and the light that had returned to his eyes over the past months seemed to have disappeared entirely. For Sarah, witnessing William's regression was devastating in ways that went beyond immediate concern for his well-being. She had watched her son emerge from silence and isolation through Margaret's patient work, had begun to believe that his healing was sustainable rather than fragile. Seeing him retreat so completely at the first sign of disruption made her question whether the progress had been real or merely dependent on circumstances that could be withdrawn at any moment. That night, Alexander and Sarah found themselves having the most honest conversation about their son since their divorce. They acknowledged that William's attachment to Margaret had become deeper and more complex than either had initially understood. While her methods had clearly helped him develop new ways of processing emotions and communicating with others, they had also created a dependency that left him vulnerable when that support was suddenly unavailable. The conversation forced both parents to confront questions they had been avoiding about William's long-term needs and their own limitations as emotional guides for a child whose inner world remained partially mysterious to them. They had trusted Margaret to bridge gaps in their understanding, to provide insights and support that their own parenting couldn't access. But her sudden absence revealed how much of William's progress had been tied to her specific presence, rather than internalized skills he could maintain independently. As they talked, Alexander found himself sharing doubts about the path they had chosen for William's healing. The institutional opposition they had faced now seemed less like ignorant resistance and more like legitimate concern about approaches that created dependencies rather than building sustainable coping mechanisms. What if the critics had been right to worry about methods that couldn't be replicated or sustained without the specific practitioner who had developed them? But Sarah, despite her medical training and respect for evidence-based practices, couldn't dismiss what she had witnessed in William's transformation. The boy who had been disappearing into silence and isolation had found his voice through Margaret's work, had developed creativity and confidence that extended far beyond their therapeutic sessions. The current regression was painful, but it didn't negate months of genuine progress and growth. Their conversation continued past midnight, ranging across topics they had never adequately addressed during their marriage. They talked about their own childhoods, about the ways their families had handled emotional difficulties, about the gap between their theoretical understanding of child development and the practical challenges of parenting a sensitive, creative boy who experienced the world differently than his peers. Saturday morning brought no improvement in William's condition. He remained in his room, barely eating, unresponsive to attempts at engagement from either parent. The textile materials that had become his artistic vocabulary lay untouched, as if Margaret's absence had severed his connection, not just to her guidance, but to the entire mode of expression she had helped him develop. Alexander made the decision to drive to Hartford to check on Margaret and assess when she might be able to return to work with William. The journey gave him time to process the events of the past 2 days, to consider how quickly their carefully constructed progress had unraveled when tested by unexpected circumstances. Hartford Hospital's intensive care unit was a world away from the quiet intimacy of Margaret's textile work with William. The sterile environment, beeping monitors, and clinical efficiency created an atmosphere that seemed to exist in direct opposition to the gentle, sensory-based healing Margaret had brought to his son. Finding her there, sitting beside her unconscious mother's bed, reminded Alexander of how little he actually knew about the woman who had become so central to his family's well-being. Margaret looked exhausted in ways that went beyond simple sleep deprivation. The strong, patient presence that had anchored William's healing process seemed diminished by worry and grief that she was struggling to contain. When Alexander arrived, she looked up with surprise that quickly shifted to concern about William's reaction to her absence. The conversation that followed revealed dimensions of Margaret's life that Alexander had never considered. Her mother, Dorothy Williams, had been a seamstress before her, working in textile mills during the Civil Rights era, and later establishing her own small alterations business. Margaret had learned not just sewing techniques from her mother, but approaches to healing and community support that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that survival often required creating beauty and meaning from whatever materials were available. Dorothy's stroke had interrupted more than just Margaret's work with individual children. She had been the keeper of family history, the source of stories and wisdom that informed Margaret's understanding of how textile work could serve emotional and spiritual healing. Losing her would mean losing access to knowledge that couldn't be replaced or replicated through formal training. As Margaret shared these details, Alexander began to understand that William's attachment to her wasn't just about therapeutic technique, but about connection to something larger and more complex. Through Margaret's work, his son had tapped into traditions of healing that existed outside institutional frameworks, approaches to processing difficulty and finding meaning that had sustained communities through generations of struggle and displacement. But Margaret's current crisis also highlighted the fragility of knowledge that existed primarily in individual practitioners rather than established systems. If Dorothy didn't recover, if Margaret couldn't continue her work, the children who might benefit from their approaches would have no alternatives within conventional therapeutic frameworks. Alexander found himself proposing something that surprised them both. He offered to fund whatever support Dorothy needed for her recovery, to hire private nurses and specialists, to ensure that Margaret could focus on her mother's care without worrying about financial pressures. But more significantly, he suggested that perhaps the time had come to create more systematic approaches to the kind of work Margaret did, to develop programs that could serve more children while preserving the wisdom that made her methods effective. Margaret's response was complex, mixing gratitude with wariness about institutionalizing work that had always succeeded precisely because it operated outside formal structures. She appreciated Alexander's generosity, but she worried about losing the intimate, individualized attention that made textile therapy effective for children like William, who had been failed by conventional approaches. Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse's report that Dorothy was showing signs of increased brain activity, suggesting the possibility of recovery that doctors had initially doubted. The news brought tears of relief to Margaret's eyes, but also raised questions about how long her mother's rehabilitation might take, and what that would mean for her commitments to William and other children who depended on her support. Alexander left Hartford with a deeper understanding of the complexities surrounding William's healing, but also with ideas about how to address the institutional gaps that made children like his son vulnerable when individual practitioners were unavailable. The drive home gave him time to consider possibilities he had never imagined, ways of bridging the divide between Margaret's wisdom and the systematic approaches that could make similar help available to more families. He returned to Greenwich to find that William had emerged from his room but remained largely nonverbal, going through the motions of weekend activities without the engagement and enthusiasm that had characterized his recent progress. Sarah reported that their son had touched his textile materials briefly, but had abandoned them without creating anything, as if Margaret's absence had severed his connection to that mode of expression. The weekend passed in careful attention to William's emotional state, with both parents trying to provide support while avoiding pressure that might drive him further into withdrawal. They read stories together, took quiet walks through the gardens Sarah had designed, and maintained routines that offered structure. Without demanding responses, William wasn't ready to give. Sunday evening brought news that would begin to shift the trajectory of their crisis. Dr. Rodriguez from the Children's Creative Therapy Center called Alexander, having heard about Margaret's family emergency through the interconnected networks of therapeutic professionals. She offered to visit William, not to replace Margaret, but to provide temporary support during this difficult transition. Dr. Rodriguez's approach was different from Margaret's, but grounded in similar understanding of how creative modalities could reach children who struggled with verbal communication. She brought art supplies instead of textiles, invited William to express his feelings through drawing and painting rather than fabric arrangements. While the medium was different, the underlying philosophy was similar, honoring the child's natural ways of processing emotions rather than forcing him into predetermined therapeutic frameworks. William's response to Dr. Rodriguez was tentative, but positive. He created drawings that clearly expressed his worry about Margaret, his confusion about her absence, and his fear that she might not return. The artwork wasn't as sophisticated as his textile stories, but it served a similar function in helping him externalize and communicate feelings that words couldn't adequately capture. More importantly, Dr. Rodriguez's presence reminded William that healing relationships could exist with different people using different methods. Margaret's absence was painful, but it didn't mean that all support and understanding had disappeared from his world. Other adults could recognize and honor his particular ways of processing experiences, even if their approaches varied from what he had grown accustomed to. The following week brought continued uncertainty about Margaret's return, but also gradual signs that William was developing resilience that went beyond dependence on any single relationship. He began incorporating some of Dr. Rodriguez's art therapy techniques into his own creative expression, combining drawing with textile work in ways that expanded rather than replaced his original methods. At school, William made the decision to proceed with his presentation, modified to include both fabric arrangements and drawings that explained his feelings about Margaret's absence and his hope for her return. The presentation was more emotionally raw than what he had originally planned, but it demonstrated growth in his ability to process and communicate difficulty, rather than simply avoiding or withdrawing from challenging circumstances. His classmates' response surprised everyone, including Mrs. Patterson. Rather than confusion or judgment, William's honest expression of worry and hope seemed to touch something universal in the children's experience. Several students shared their own stories of people they missed, of times when support they depended on had been temporarily unavailable, of ways they had learned to cope with uncertainty and change. The presentation became an impromptu lesson about resilience and community support, with children naturally offering encouragement and understanding to a classmate who was processing difficulty in public. Mrs. Patterson found herself witnessing the kind of emotional intelligence and mutual support that formal curricula struggled to achieve, but that seemed to emerge naturally when children were allowed to share authentic experiences. Alexander, who attended the presentation with camera in hand to document William's moment of sharing, found himself moved by more than just his son's courage. He watched a classroom of 8-year-olds demonstrate wisdom about healing and community that many adults never developed, saw children naturally offering support and understanding without the institutional barriers that often complicated adult attempts at help. The weeks that followed brought news of Dorothy's steady improvement and Margaret's gradual ability to return to her work, initially on a limited basis, while managing her mother's rehabilitation needs. But the crisis had created changes that couldn't be simply reversed when Margaret became available again. William had developed relationships with Dr. Rodriguez and other therapeutic supporters, had learned that healing could come from multiple sources rather than depending entirely on one special person. Margaret's return to work with William was joyful, but different from their original relationship. The boy had grown during her absence, had developed independence and resilience that made their sessions more collaborative and less dependent. She found herself working with a child who could now articulate his own therapeutic needs, who understood his creative processes well enough to guide their sessions rather than simply responding to her suggestions. The changes in William created opportunities for Margaret to expand her work in ways she had never considered. Dr. Rodriguez's offer of collaboration at the Children's Creative Therapy Center seemed more feasible now that Margaret could see how institutional support might enhance, rather than replace, the individual attention that made her methods effective. Over the following months, Margaret began working within the center's framework, while maintaining her private practice with children like William, who had developed long-term therapeutic relationships with her. The arrangement allowed her to reach more children while contributing to research about textile therapy and other creative approaches to healing trauma and communication difficulties. Alexander found himself becoming an advocate for therapeutic approaches that honored children's natural wisdom rather than forcing them into predetermined frameworks. He used his business connections and social influence to support research and program development that might make Margaret's methods available to families who couldn't afford private therapeutic services. The transformation in his perspective went beyond support for alternative healing modalities. Working with Margaret and Dr. Rodriguez had shown him how many assumptions about expertise and authority were based on institutional credentials rather than actual effectiveness in helping children. He began questioning other areas where conventional wisdom might be limiting rather than serving the people it claimed to help. William's continued growth provided ongoing evidence that healing approaches could be both unconventional and highly effective when they matched children's individual needs and learning styles. His textile stories became increasingly sophisticated, combining narrative complexity with emotional insight that impressed teachers, therapists, and other children who witnessed his presentations. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationship between Alexander and his son. Working through the crisis of Margaret's absence had required Alexander to develop emotional attunement and support skills that he had previously delegated to others. He learned to recognize William's nonverbal communications, to provide comfort during difficult moments, to celebrate creative expressions that didn't fit conventional categories. The father who had once been mystified by his son's sensitivity became someone who could appreciate and nurture those same qualities. Alexander's business success had been built on emotional detachment and strategic thinking, but parenting William effectively required him to develop empathy and intuition that enhanced rather than compromised his other capabilities. Sarah noticed these changes during their co-parenting interactions, seeing in Alexander an emotional availability that had been absent during their marriage. While they didn't reconcile romantically, they developed a partnership around William's care that was more collaborative and effective than their relationship had ever been. Their son benefited not just from individual healing, but from parents who had learned to support his growth as a team rather than as adversaries negotiating custody arrangements. The community response to William's transformation and Margaret's expanding work created ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate circle. Other families began seeking alternative therapeutic approaches for children who struggled with conventional methods. Schools started incorporating creative therapies into their support programs. Mental health professionals became more open to collaborating with practitioners whose expertise came from experience rather than formal training. But the most profound changes were personal rather than institutional. Alexander discovered that supporting his son's healing had required him to examine his own relationship with vulnerability and emotional expression. The man who had built walls around his feelings to protect himself from the emotional chaos of his childhood learned that those same walls prevented him from connecting with people who mattered most to him. Margaret's work with William had revealed that healing often required moving toward, rather than away from, emotional difficulty, that strength could come from acknowledging, rather than denying, the places where people felt most fragile. For Alexander, this meant learning to sit with his son's tears without trying to fix them immediately, to offer presence rather than solutions when comfort was more needed than advice. The lessons extended beyond parenting into all areas of Alexander's life. His leadership style became more collaborative and emotionally intelligent. His business relationships deepened beyond transactional exchanges to include genuine care for the people he worked with. His social interactions moved beyond networking toward authentic connection with people whose experiences and perspectives differed from his own. A year after Margaret first walked into his home with her bag of fabrics and patient wisdom, Alexander found himself hosting a fundraising event for the Children's Creative Therapy Center in the same mansion where he had once questioned whether his son needed professional help rather than folk remedies. The evening brought together families, therapists, educators, and community leaders who had been touched by approaches to healing that honored rather than pathologized children's natural ways of processing the world. William served as one of the evening's presenters, sharing textile stories that demonstrated how creative expression could serve healing and communication for children who struggled with traditional approaches. His presentation was confident and articulate, showing not just recovery from his earlier difficulties, but growth into a young person whose sensitivity had become a strength rather than a liability. Margaret was also recognized that evening, receiving an award for innovation in therapeutic practice that acknowledged her contributions to understanding how traditional wisdom could inform contemporary healing approaches. Her acceptance speech was characteristically humble, focusing on the children who had taught her more than she had taught them, the families who had trusted her with their most precious relationships, the community that had learned to value different kinds of expertise. But for Alexander, the most meaningful moment of the evening came when William introduced him as a father who had learned that the best way to help his son wasn't to change him, but to understand him. The boy's words carried wisdom that went beyond his 9 years, reflecting insights about love and acceptance that had taken Alexander decades to develop. The evening concluded with William's most ambitious textile story yet, a collaborative piece that included contributions from other children who had worked with Margaret and Dr. Rodriguez. The fabric landscape they created together told a story about healing that emphasized community rather than individual transformation, about the ways that people could support each other's growth when they learned to appreciate rather than judge differences in how emotions were processed and expressed. As guests examined the textile story, Alexander found himself standing beside Margaret, both of them watching children and adults discover new ways of understanding communication and creativity. The contrast with their first meeting couldn't have been more complete. Where he had once seen only a simple seamstress working in a humble shop, he now recognized a healer whose wisdom about human nature surpassed most professional training he had encountered. Margaret's quiet observation about the evening captured something essential about the journey they had all undertaken. She noted that William's growth had required not just her textile techniques, but a community of people willing to reconsider their assumptions about healing and support. Alexander's transformation had been as significant as his son's, moving from skepticism and dismissal toward appreciation and advocacy for approaches that operated outside conventional frameworks. The months that followed brought continued expansion of programs that made creative therapeutic approaches available to more families throughout Connecticut and beyond. Margaret's methods were being studied and adapted by researchers who recognized the value of incorporating traditional wisdom into contemporary healing practices. William's story became part of a growing body of evidence that children's natural ways of processing emotions could be honored and supported rather than redirected or corrected. But beneath all the programmatic success and institutional recognition, the core relationship between Margaret, William, and Alexander continued to deepen in ways that went beyond therapeutic outcomes. They had become family to each other, connected by experiences of vulnerability and growth that created bonds stronger than blood or professional obligation. William's development into a confident, creative young person who could navigate both his sensitive nature and social expectations provided ongoing evidence that healing approaches could be both effective and sustainable when they matched children's authentic needs. His textile stories continued to evolve, incorporating new techniques and themes, while maintaining the emotional honesty that had characterized his work from the beginning. Alexander's evolution into a father who could provide emotional support as well as material resources created stability for William that went beyond what any single therapeutic relationship could offer. The man who had once felt mystified by his son's inner world became someone who could appreciate and nurture those same qualities that made William unique among his peers. Margaret's integration of her traditional methods with institutional support allowed her to reach more children while maintaining the intimate attention that made her work effective. Her collaboration with Dr. Rodriguez and other professionals created models for how different types of expertise could complement rather than compete with each other in service of children's well-being. 2 years after their first meeting, Margaret received an invitation that represented the culmination of changes that had begun with one boy's silence and one woman's patient response. The International Conference on Creative Therapies asked her to present the keynote address about traditional approaches to healing that could inform contemporary therapeutic practice. The invitation represented recognition that Margaret had spent decades earning through quiet service rather than academic credentials. Her work with William and other children had demonstrated that healing expertise could come from experience and wisdom rather than formal training. That sometimes the most effective therapeutic approaches were those that honored, rather than tried to correct children's natural ways of processing the world. Margaret's presentation to hundreds of therapists, researchers, and educators from around the world focused on the story of William's transformation and the community changes that had resulted from their work together. She spoke about the importance of meeting children where they were rather than where professionals thought they should be, about the value of traditional wisdom in informing contemporary healing practices, about the need for therapeutic approaches that built on rather than replaced children's natural strengths. But the heart of her presentation was about relationship rather than technique, about the way healing happened in spaces of safety and acceptance, rather than through implementation of specific methodologies. William's growth had resulted not just from textile work but from experiencing adults who could see his sensitivity as a gift rather than a problem, who could provide support without trying to change the essential nature of who he was. Alexander attended Margaret's presentation, bringing William with him to witness the recognition of work that had transformed their family's understanding of healing and support. For the boy, seeing Margaret honored by professionals from around the world provided validation that his own experiences of textile therapy were part of something larger and more significant than individual healing. The conference also provided opportunities for Alexander to share his perspective as a parent who had learned to question assumptions about expertise and authority when it came to his child's well-being. His business background and social influence gave weight to his advocacy for therapeutic approaches that operated outside conventional frameworks, helping other families consider alternatives when traditional methods weren't serving their children's needs. Following the conference, requests for training and consultation poured in from therapeutic centers, schools, and community organizations around the world. Margaret found herself traveling to share her methods while maintaining her core practice with local children whose ongoing needs required consistent attention and support. The expansion of her work created new challenges, but also opportunities to demonstrate that traditional wisdom could be systematized and taught without losing the essential qualities that made it effective. Margaret developed training programs that emphasized relationship and attunement over technique, teaching other practitioners to recognize and honor children's natural healing capacities rather than imposing predetermined therapeutic goals. William's role in these developments evolved from patient to teacher, sharing his own understanding of how textile work had helped him process emotions and communicate experiences that words couldn't adequately capture. His presentations to groups of therapists and educators provided insights that could only come from someone who had experienced healing from the inside, whose growth demonstrated the effectiveness of approaches that honored rather than tried to correct children's particular ways of being in the world. The boy who had once retreated into silence became an articulate advocate for therapeutic approaches that recognized children's wisdom about their own healing needs. His textile stories continued to evolve, incorporating increasing complexity and sophistication, while maintaining the emotional honesty that had characterized his work from the beginning. As William approached his 10th birthday, Alexander reflected on the journey that had begun with his casual cruelty toward a woman whose worth he couldn't recognize, and had evolved into relationships that had transformed not just his son's life, but his own understanding of healing, community, and the proper relationship between expertise and wisdom. The man who had once dismissed Margaret as an anachronism came to understand that her traditional approaches to healing contained insights that contemporary therapeutic practice needed to rediscover. Her patient work with individual children demonstrated principles about relationship and attunement that formal training often overlooked in favor of technique and methodology. Margaret's own journey from working in shadows to receiving international recognition for her contributions to therapeutic practice represented more than individual success. It demonstrated the value of approaches that operated outside institutional frameworks, the importance of honoring traditional wisdom in contemporary healing practices, the need for therapeutic modalities that built on, rather than replaced, children's natural capacities for growth and communication. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in the relationship between Alexander and Margaret herself. The casual contempt he had once shown toward her had evolved into respect and appreciation that went beyond gratitude for her work with William. He came to understand that her patience in the face of his initial rudeness had demonstrated the same wisdom that made her effective with children who had been wounded by adult misunderstanding and judgment. Their collaboration in expanding access to creative therapeutic approaches created a partnership based on complementary strengths rather than hierarchical relationships. Alexander's business expertise and social connections enhanced Margaret's traditional wisdom and therapeutic skill, while her insights about healing and community informed his understanding of leadership and social responsibility. The textile therapy program they developed together served hundreds of children throughout Connecticut and beyond, providing alternatives for families whose children struggled with conventional therapeutic approaches. But more importantly, their work demonstrated that healing communities could be created when people learned to appreciate rather than judge differences in how emotions were processed and expressed. William's 10th birthday celebration took place in Margaret's shop, the same space where Alexander had once made his dismissive comments about museums and authenticity. The small room was filled with children whose lives had been touched by textile therapy, parents who had learned to support rather than try to fix their children's particular ways of being in the world, and professionals who had discovered that traditional wisdom could enhance rather than compete with contemporary therapeutic training. The birthday boy's request for the location surprised no one who knew him well. The shop represented not just the beginning of his healing journey, but his understanding that the most important transformations often happened in humble spaces, where people met each other with authentic presence, rather than professional credentials or social status. Margaret's gift to William was a sewing machine of his own, along with a collection of fabrics and threads that would allow him to continue developing his textile stories as he grew older. But more significantly, she shared with him a letter his great-great-grandmother had written about the importance of creating beauty and meaning from whatever materials life provided, connecting his healing journey to traditions of resilience and creativity that spanned generations. Alexander's gift was different but equally meaningful. He established a scholarship fund that would ensure textile therapy and other creative healing approaches were available to children whose families couldn't afford private therapeutic services. The fund represented his commitment to making the approaches that had saved his son accessible to other families facing similar challenges. But the most precious gift was the community that had formed around William's healing journey. Children who had found their voices through creative expression, Parents who had learned to support rather than try to change their children's essential natures. Professionals who had discovered that expertise could come from experience and wisdom rather than formal credentials alone. As the celebration continued around them, Alexander found himself in conversation with Margaret about the changes that had resulted from their unlikely partnership. She observed that William's transformation had required not just therapeutic technique, but a community willing to question assumptions about healing and support. Adults capable of learning from children, rather than only trying to teach them. Alexander acknowledged that his own growth had been as significant as his son's, moving from skepticism and judgment toward appreciation for approaches that operated outside conventional frameworks. Learning to support William's healing had required him to examine his own relationship with vulnerability and emotional expression, to develop capacities for empathy and connection that enhanced rather than compromised his other strengths. Their conversation was interrupted by William's announcement that he wanted to share a special textile story he had created for the occasion. The piece he unveiled was his most sophisticated work yet, a fabric landscape that told the story of a family learning to understand and support each other's differences, a community discovering that healing could come from unexpected sources when people learned to appreciate rather than judge unfamiliar approaches to processing the world. As William explained his textile story, describing how different fabrics represented various stages of growth and understanding, both Margaret and Alexander recognized themes that reflected their own journey together. The rough burlap that represented initial misunderstanding and conflict, the soft cotton that showed growing trust and acceptance, the silk threads that connected different parts of the landscape in patterns of mutual support and appreciation. The story concluded with William's vision of how families and communities could support children whose gifts existed outside conventional expectations, how adults could learn to recognize and nurture rather than try to redirect or correct the particular ways that sensitive children processed emotions and communicated with the world. The evening ended with a collaborative textile project that included contributions from everyone present, creating a community story that emphasized connection and mutual support rather than individual achievement. Children and adults worked together, combining different materials and techniques to create something that none could have accomplished alone. As the last guests departed and Margaret's shop returned to its normal quiet, Alexander helped clean up while William carefully packed his new sewing machine and fabrics. The evening had provided a celebration not just of the boy's birthday, but of the community that had formed around approaches to healing that honored rather than pathologized differences in how people processed emotions and communicated with the world. Margaret's final observation of the evening captured something essential about the journey they had all undertaken together. She noted that William's healing had demonstrated the importance of meeting children where they were, rather than where adults thought they should be, of providing support that built on rather than tried to replace their natural capacities for growth and self-expression. Alexander's response reflected his own transformation from skepticism toward appreciation for wisdom that existed outside institutional frameworks. He acknowledged that learning to support his son effectively had required him to question assumptions about expertise and authority, to recognize that healing often came from relationships and approaches that couldn't be easily categorized or replicated through formal systems. As they prepared to leave, William made one final addition to the collaborative textile story. A small piece of velvet that he explained represented gratitude for adults who had learned to see children's differences as gifts rather than problems to be solved. The addition was both simple and profound, capturing in fabric and placement what words couldn't adequately express about transformation that had happened through patience and acceptance rather than technique and intervention. The drive home through Greenwich's quiet streets provided time for reflection on changes that had begun with casual cruelty and evolved into relationships that had transformed multiple lives. Alexander found himself thinking about the man he had been 2 years earlier, confident in his judgments about people and approaches that existed outside his familiar frameworks, certain that expertise came primarily through institutional credentials and social status. William's gentle questions about the evening, his observations about how different people had contributed to the collaborative textile story, demonstrated wisdom about community and support that went far beyond his 10 years. The boy who had once retreated into silence had become someone who could recognize and appreciate the particular gifts that different people brought to shared endeavors. Margaret's patient work had accomplished more than individual healing. She had demonstrated that transformation was possible when people learned to approach differences with curiosity rather than judgment, when adults developed capacity to learn from children rather than only trying to teach them, when communities created space for approaches to healing that honored rather than tried to correct the various ways that people processed emotions and communicated with the world. As they arrived home and William headed upstairs to set up his new sewing machine, Alexander realized that the most important lesson from their journey together wasn't about therapeutic technique or alternative healing modalities. It was about the transformative power of learning to see people accurately, rather than through the filters of assumption and prejudice. About the healing that became possible when communities learned to appreciate, rather than judge, differences in how individuals experienced and expressed their authentic selves. The boy who had found his voice through textile work, the woman whose traditional wisdom had gained institutional recognition, and the man who had learned to question his assumptions about expertise and authority, had created something together that none could have accomplished alone. Their individual transformations had contributed to community changes that would influence how many other families approached healing and support for children whose gifts existed outside conventional expectations. Standing in his son's doorway, watching William carefully arrange his new materials, with the reverence of someone who understood their capacity to create beauty and meaning from difficult experiences, Alexander felt gratitude that went beyond words. The journey that had begun with his casual dismissal of someone whose worth he couldn't recognize had evolved into relationships and understanding that had enriched his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. Margaret's teaching that healing happened through relationship rather than technique, that wisdom could come from experience and tradition rather than formal training alone, that children often knew more about their own needs than adults who tried to redirect them toward predetermined goals, had influenced not just William's recovery, but Alexander's understanding of leadership, community, and the proper relationship between expertise and authentic wisdom. The textile stories that had given William his voice would continue to evolve as he grew older, incorporating new experiences and insights while maintaining the emotional honesty that had characterized his work from the beginning. But more importantly, his healing journey had demonstrated that children's particular ways of processing the world could be honored and supported, rather than corrected or redirected, when adults learn to appreciate rather than judge differences in emotional expression and communication. As Alexander turned off the light in William's room, leaving his son to arrange his new materials and patterns that would guide tomorrow's creative work, he reflected on transformations that had required all of them to move beyond familiar assumptions toward new understanding of healing, community, and the various ways that people could support each other's growth and authentic self-expression. The story that had begun with casual cruelty towards someone whose worth he couldn't recognize had evolved into relationships and community connections that demonstrated the transformative power of learning to see people accurately, rather than through filters of prejudice and assumption. In the quiet of the evening, with William safely settled, and Margaret's wisdom continuing to guide their family's approach to healing and support, Alexander understood that the most important transformations often began with simple recognition that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, when people learned to approach differences with curiosity rather than judgment, when communities created space for approaches that honored rather than tried to fix the various ways that individuals processed emotions and communicated with the world. Margaret's patient wisdom, William's courage in sharing his authentic voice, and Alexander's willingness to question his own limitations had created changes that would influence many other families and communities struggling with similar challenges. The textile stories would continue, the community of families supporting children with different needs would grow, and the approaches that had saved his son would become available to other families facing similar challenges. But the heart of what they had learned together would remain constant, that healing happened through relationships built on acceptance and appreciation, rather than judgment and correction, that children's natural wisdom about their own needs deserved respect and support rather than redirection toward predetermined goals. The man who had once laughed at a black seamstress had learned that transformation was possible when people approached each other with humility rather than assumption, when communities learned to value different kinds of expertise and wisdom, when families created space for children to grow according to their authentic natures, rather than forcing them into predetermined molds. William's voice, found through fabric and thread and patient encouragement from someone whose worth Alexander had initially failed to recognize, would continue to grow stronger and more confident. But more importantly, his healing journey had demonstrated principles about acceptance and support that would influence how their entire community approached differences in emotional expression and communication for generations to come.